Hi, everyone. Welcome to our series on diversity and dementia. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. This series is generously brought to you in support with the support of ISAI, a human healthcare company. Today, I'm really excited to have with us Lenora Higginbotham. She is an assistant professor at Emory University in neuroscience, specializing in studying dementia, due to a personal experience which inspired her to take up a career in neurology. So Lenora, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with your grandmother, because that's really where your journey with I should say it's Parkinson's, but neurodegeneration began. Tell us a little bit about your grandmother's story.
Yeah, so my grandmother, I believe, went through a long period of not being diagnosed with Parkinson's, but and we weren't quite sure what was going on, but in her 70s, she started slowing down quite a bit. Looking back on it, there were all these signs that it was probably something more than the arthritis that we attributed it to. She had a car accident at one point. We thought, okay, maybe that kind of also worsened things. But, she would just take a really long time to get up, very slow. She used to ask us to count to 10 before she could do certain things, like walk to one side of the room or get up. She also would have to stand there and tell her foot to move. So she would get stuck at times. And it's, looking back, it's just, I think she just had a long period of just us not knowing what was going on. But then later on in her disease, particularly after moving in with family and moving down to Atlanta, she was ultimately diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
And later dementia, right? Which is common with Parkinson's.
Yeah, and later she develops dementia. And I was just going to say that one key aspect, I was talking with a family member about it the other day, is that she didn't have tremor, which I think, it's not really understood sometimes that up to a third of Parkinson's patients don't have tremor. So you don't have to have tremor to have this diagnosis. But I think when she was put on levodopa, it was clear she had an improvement. She developed dyskinesia. So she ultimately did receive a diagnosis.
How many years ago was that when she was diagnosed?
Oh man, so I was probably right in between college and med school. So that was probably around the late 2008, 2009, perhaps somewhere around there.
So how hard was it for your family to get a diagnosis? I mean, was there, we hear stories often where, especially what you're saying is like she didn't have obvious tremors, right? So no one would automatically think, oh, it's Parkinson's. What was your experience as a family getting a diagnosis?
I was just talking with my aunt the other day. My grandmother moved in with her after they lived in New Orleans. So, I think part of it is also none of us lived with them, for a long time until Katrina, and then they moved in with my aunt, and my aunt was noticing how just slow she was. And my aunt reminded me the other day that she actually asked the geriatrician if something like levodopa or dopamine would help, because she just noticed how slow she was. And so they tried the carbidopa levodopa, and at that point I wasn't at those visits, but reportedly, per my aunt, it was just very dramatic, the response. And then that kind of prompted her to go see a neurologist, and she was followed in the Emory Movement Disorders Clinic for quite a while.
So now, and you have since become you're a researcher in neurology, and tell us a little bit about that decision. Was that directly related to your grandmother?
I think it was definitely a big part of it towards the end of my med school career, when I was trying to decide what to do. My grandmother was struggling more and more with cognitive decline. She had a hospitalization where she became frankly delirious, and vividly remember going through that around the time I was trying to decide what specialty to go into in med school. So it was definitely a big part of the decision and motivating part. I would also say around that time I did a rotation in our geriatric psychiatry unit, which interestingly had a lot of dementia patients, and quite a few of them were movement disorders patients as well. And I was just struck by how different everybody was, yet they carried some of the same diagnoses, how personal, psychosis could be. One person's hallucinations don't look like another's, and how these patients really reminded me a lot of my grandmother. And I just really liked working with them. And so that rotation kind of solidified it. And then I started doing research in med school, which then kind of brought the whole picture together in Alzheimer's disease. And I just realized I really liked neurodegeneration and biomarkers. And so I guess, putting all those pieces together, it's probably no surprise that now I do movement disorders. I specialize in researching Lewy body dementia and focusing on biomarkers for that disorder. So I think it, definitely she was a big piece of the puzzle.
And one of your efforts, as we feature on Being Patient, is to really get more African Americans involved in research, because we know that they are, the African Americans, Latinos will end up with higher percentage of cases of dementia. And tell us a little bit about that effort. First, let's talk about, historically, there hasn't been as many minorities that we need in research to really piece the puzzle together. Tell us a little bit about why you think that is, and then we can talk about, what you're doing and how you're inspiring people to convince them to that research, to be a part of research.
Yeah, I mean, I think minority populations, there's probably a variety of factors. One, there's definitely not, in terms of disparities, there's not the same access to healthcare, which can be cross-section with socioeconomic factors as well. But that culturally, there may not be the same trust in research, the same seeking out of research opportunities as well among minority populations in general, given our history in the country. And so I think, and then there's just on top of that, in terms of access and then, mistrust, there may also just be a lack of knowledge in certain populations or certain regions, communities of these disorders. I'm not entirely sure, our family is African American educated, but we just did not have the knowledge, to really seek out. I think there's a lot more opportunities now with internet and things like this, but we just didn't have the knowledge base. But somebody has to, confer that knowledge to you. Somebody has to go out and, educate the community. So I think those are some reasons why, African Americans are just historically not participating as much in neurodegenerative research. And Emory has, we live in Atlanta. This city is full of minorities, and yet we noticed we were just having a similar issue. We just couldn't get, particularly within our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which does, collects huge numbers every year of dementia patients. We just were not getting African Americans, and our group did not look like our city, our population. And so this was years ago. We established in the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which is, I work through there to recruit Lewy body dementia patients. We established a minority engagement corps. It's run by an excellent group of people, including Monica Parker, who heads it. They have done a lot of community outreach. They established connections with, certain populations, influential minority populations in the city, to try to get knowledge out there about research and diseases, neurodegenerative diseases. And, their goal was to recruit 50% of 50% African Americans, each year, like work to a 50% split. And as I recall, we are either very near that for Alzheimer's disease or have met that at least in the last year or two. So we've definitely increased our African American participation quite a bit. We still have a little ways to go because some of those patients are maybe not necessarily participating in every aspect, such as brain donation, things like that. So I think that, and certain biospecimen collection, but I think, that just requires, more knowledge, more community outreach. And so I work closely with the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So a lot of what I'm doing with Lewy body disease is carried out through the same, in the same collaboration with the Minority Engagement Forum. We're just working really to have those that representation.
How much is stigma around speaking of a neurodegenerative disease? Do you run into that when you speak to patients or when you're trying to recruit? Is it difficult to really talk about a neurodegenerative disease? I mean, a lot of people just don't want to talk about it because if you don't talk about it, it's not really there. Have you found that this is a stigma or an issue?
I don't, in terms of the diversity thing across minorities, I don't necessarily find that it's harder among minorities or any particular type of ethnic population to discuss neurodegeneration or necessarily accept it. I mean, I think that there's a certain level of resistance or denial, or that's a little bit natural, like among families that you encounter every now and then. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's just one group of patients, or I see it more among one ethnicity versus another. I do think it really does help to have the time and really explain, because I find that basically a lot of patients may come and out from the community, maybe just in not as knowledgeable areas or with specialty centers like ours, and they may be resistant to a diagnosis of Parkinson's or anything. And then when you just sit them down, because we often spend about an hour and a half with our first visit, and just explain the disease and all the symptoms and this and that, it really does help. But also to explain that in terms of like several of these diseases, like for instance for Parkinson's disease, there's a lot of symptomatic treatments out there, a lot of hope, a lot of ways that we can make your quality of life better. Dementia is a lot harder. We don't have the same types of treatments for that, but I think it goes a long way explaining to kind of chip away at that denial a little bit and really break it down.
From a researcher's perspective, what does it mean for the equation of searching for, a cure, a treatment for Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias? What does it mean from your perspective to have a more represented community and more diversity within research?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that we're finding, our group actually does proteomics research, which for those who are not familiar, we take samples and we look at a wide range of proteins in a data set. And we kind of compare across individuals, but across diseases, what proteins are changing and how we can use those protein changes to identify people, treat people, et cetera. But what we're finding, and a lot of people are finding, is that one, there's a lot of individual variability. So even in Parkinson's disease, if you take 100 people with Parkinson's disease, their protein profiles look could vary in a variety of different ways, just based on maybe other diseases they've had, genetic predispositions, age, like a variety of things. People can look very different. Same with Alzheimer's disease, right? And we're finding that people just look different even within a disease. We find that ethnicities can look different within a disease, individuals can look different within a disease. And, one speculation as to why some of the treatments, haven't been, particularly at Alzheimer's disease, which is, at the forefront of treatments, probably ahead of the game in terms of like doing these disease modifying treatments than maybe Parkinson's and Lewy bodies. But one reason some of these amyloid treatments or some of these other treatments haven't been just hard hitting successful, and maybe all this variability we're seeing, we call heterogeneity within disease. And so in order to really define this full spectrum, we need to measure full protein profiles like we're doing, but we also need a representation of people. Like, we're already finding in some of our big time biomarkers, just like tau and this cerebrospinal fluid. A lot of people have probably heard of that, right? We measure that a lot in the clinic. Well, that differs between Caucasians and African Americans. So African Americans with Alzheimer's disease tend to have lower tau than Caucasians. So in truth, the biomarker tau is a better biomarker for Caucasians than it is for African Americans. But how do we know that? Oh, only after looking at African Americans, later on. So, when we're trying to define, these biomarkers and learning how to individually treat people, coming up with really effective therapies, really effective means of identifying people, we need to know the full range of variability out there. We need like a full spectrum of, diversity.
Yeah,
so
that's so important. And that was such a great explanation of why it really matters to make a difference, and how we are all unique, but how diseases present themselves differently in different subsets of population. So tell me, just to conclude here, did your grandmother know that you were going into neurology and neuroscience?
I guess yes and no. I mean, I think, towards the end, when I really had decided, I think she passed away, unfortunately, in my third year of residency, between second and third year. And so by that time, I think it might have been harder for her to grasp certain things. I know I wasn't, I moved from Atlanta to Baltimore towards the end there to do residency. And I know I didn't talk to her. It was more difficult to talk to her like I used to in person or on the phone. It was just more difficult. And so not really, and I know she really didn't fully grasp that I went into movement disorders because that was a later decision. But, she did get to go to my med school graduation, and I know she was just so excited. I think she wanted all the family to be doctors, actually.
Oh.
So, but, I'm not sure if it completely connected, but.
Right. But I mean, that's so wonderful. And, how good comes from illness or a sad situation, for you to continue on this path is really admirable. And thank you so much for sharing your story. I think the world needs more researchers like you to inspire others to go into research so that we do indeed understand neurodegeneration better. And thank you for taking the time to explain the differences that you're seeing too. I found that really interesting.
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, if you want to read more about Lenora's story, we are publishing an article, a more in-depth article on beingpatient.com, where we tell you how she was inspired, some of the work that she is doing with Lewy body, which is incredibly important. So Lenora, thank you so much for your time and coming on and being on Being Patient. We appreciate everything that you're doing.
Thank you.